What if I told you a prince asked for help, and the king didn't just say no? He cut the line entirely. No negotiation. No quiet compromise. No, we'll talk later. Just silence. And that silence is what has people stunned. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this wasn't some tabloid rumor about hurt feelings or palace gossip. This was a moment where money, power, and blood collided, and only one of them won. A reported request for a $100 million bailout. A lifeline, depending on who you ask. And a response so cold that even longtime royal watchers weren't prepared for it. Here's the part that should make you pause. This didn't leak right away. It was noticed. Phone calls that stopped going through. Messages that weren't returned. Intermediaries who suddenly had nothing to say. And in royal circles, silence isn't accidental. Silence is a decision. Ask yourself this. When someone with unlimited resources refuses to help, what are they really saying? This story matters now because the timing couldn't be worse. Pressure has been building quietly. Legal bills stacking up. Deals that once looked solid suddenly looking shaky. Friends who used to take calls now unavailable. And in the middle of it all, a name that once guaranteed protection now seems to do the opposite. For years, we were told the break was about independence. About freedom. About stepping away on one's own terms. But this moment suggests something far more brutal. Because independence sounds noble until the safety net disappears. And let's be honest, this wasn't just about money. Money is easy. Money can be transferred, disguised, delayed. What makes this moment explosive is what followed. Or rather, what didn't. No call back. No private meeting. No discreet workaround. Instead, something far more final happened. Access was cut. Think about that. In a family where courtiers, aides, and private secretaries exist precisely to keep lines open, a line went dead. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when a decision has already been made. So here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. If a father with the power to make a crisis disappear chooses not to, is that punishment, or is it a warning? Because if this was a warning, it wasn't just aimed at one person. It was aimed at everyone watching. And just when it seemed like this was about money and wounded pride, something surfaced that changed how this refusal was understood entirely. Because the request was only the beginning. What came next wasn't louder. It was colder. And it all started with a phone call that never connected. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people completely miss. Because this wasn't a casual request. It wasn't a father-son conversation that spiraled out of control. And it definitely wasn't a symbolic ask. This was precise. Calculated. Urgent. A figure surfaced that stopped people in their tracks. $100 million. Not 20. Not 10. 100. And immediately, the public reaction split in two. Some said it was exaggerated. Others said it was impossible. But insiders focused on something else entirely. Why that number? Ask yourself this. If someone asks for groceries, they ask for grocery money. If someone asks for rent, they ask for rent money. But when someone asks for a number that large, it's not about survival in the traditional sense. It's about stabilization, damage control, buying time. This wasn't about lifestyle. It was about exposure. Sources familiar with high-level negotiations say numbers like that don't come out of thin air. They're usually tied to existing obligations, legal pressure, contractual landmines, situations where failing to act fast doesn't just hurt. It multiplies. And that's what made palace observers uneasy. Because traditionally, royal assistance doesn't come as lump sums. It comes quietly, through trusts, through intermediaries, through arrangements designed so no one ever asks questions. That's how it's always been done. So why ask directly? That's the contradiction that matters. This request didn't follow protocol. It bypassed layers. It jumped the queue. And that alone suggests panic. Or desperation. Or both. When people abandon the usual channels, it's rarely because things are going well. Here's another detail that didn't sit right. The timing. This request didn't come during a public scandal. It didn't come when headlines were screaming. It came when things were quiet. Too quiet. And quiet is often when the real damage is happening behind closed doors. Think about it. Would you ask for help when everything looks fine on the surface? Or would you ask when the cracks are spreading faster than anyone realizes? And then there's the most uncomfortable question of all. If the money had been given, what would it have meant? Because money isn't neutral. Money signals approval. It signals backing. It says, whatever comes next, we're standing with you. And that's where this stops being about finances and starts being about strategy. What if the refusal wasn't about the amount, but about what paying it would imply? Because agreeing to that request wouldn't just solve a problem. It would tie the institution to whatever consequences followed. And some consequences can't be walked back. So when the answer came back negative, it wasn't emotional. It was surgical. But the money wasn't the most shocking part. The real shock came with what followed that refusal. Because after the no, something else vanished. And that disappearance would change the meaning of everything. Here's the part that still unsettles people who know how this world works. After the refusal, there should have been something. A follow-up. A cooling-off period. A back-channel message carried quietly through aides or lawyers. That's how powerful families handle fallout. They don't leave loose ends. But this time, the loose end was the point. The calls didn't connect. The messages weren't acknowledged. And the usual intermediaries suddenly had nothing to relay. Now stop for a second and think about that. In an institution built entirely on layers of communication, for silence to exist at this level means it was authorized. Silence like this doesn't happen because someone forgot to respond. It happens because responding was ruled out. And that's where the story shifts from financial drama to psychological warfare. Because silence does something rejection never can. Rejection gives you closure. Silence keeps you guessing. It forces you to replay every word, every decision, every mistake, wondering which one sealed your fate. Ask yourself honestly, which would hurt more? Being told never ask again, or being treated as if you no longer exist? What makes this even more chilling is the timing. This wasn't during a public feud. There were no fiery statements, no televised accusations, no fresh insults. On the surface, things looked calm. And yet behind the scenes, the door was closing inch by inch. People close to the situation noticed something else too. Advisors who once took meetings suddenly weren't available. Schedules filled up. Conversations became, we'll revisit this later. And later never came. That's not chaos. That's containment. Because when an institution decides it can't afford unpredictability, the first thing it does is remove access. You can't negotiate if you can't reach the table. You can't plead your case if no one will listen. And here's the contradiction that shook observers. Publicly, the image remained composed, calm, statesmanlike. Privately, the silence was absolute. No confrontation, no argument, just absence. That absence sent a message louder than any press release ever could. It said this wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a boundary. And boundaries, once enforced, are rarely temporary. Now here's the question you should be asking yourself. If silence is a form of power, who is it meant to intimidate? The person on the outside, or everyone else watching from within? Because when someone is cut off this completely, it serves as an example, a warning, a reminder that protection is conditional. And just when it became clear this silence wasn't going to break, another realization began to sink in. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about removing liability. And once that realization took hold, the situation stopped looking like a family dispute and started looking like a calculated decision with long-term consequences. Because the next step wasn't about communication at all. It was about reclassification. And that's where everything truly changed. Here's the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. At what point does a son stop being family and start being a risk? Because that's the shift that happened next. Quietly, methodically, without ceremony. This wasn't a blow-up or a dramatic declaration. It was something far more unsettling. A reclassification. In powerful institutions, people aren't just relatives. They're assets, symbols, sometimes shields. And sometimes, when the calculus changes, they become liabilities. This is the part casual observers often miss. Families argue all the time. But institutions don't argue emotionally. They assess. They weigh outcomes. They decide what can be absorbed and what must be isolated. And once someone is labeled unpredictable, the response isn't anger. It's distance. Think about the contradiction here. For years, the narrative was resilience, endurance, standing together despite controversy. Scandals came and went, and the machine kept moving. But suddenly, the tolerance vanished. Why now? Because unpredictability is manageable until it threatens stability. And stability is the one thing institutions protect at all costs. Not feelings, not history, not even blood. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Once someone is viewed as a liability, helping them becomes dangerous. Every intervention carries risk. Every bailout ties you to outcomes you can't control. And if things go wrong, the blame doesn't stop with the individual. It spreads. So the safest move isn't to fix the problem. It's to step away from it. That's why this moment feels so final. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't done. No shield raised. No quiet cleanup. No last-minute rescue. Just a deliberate decision to let events unfold without interference. Ask yourself this. If protection is conditional, what happens when the conditions are no longer met? This wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. About signaling that no one is indispensable. That titles don't override consequences. And that once someone crosses a certain line, the institution will choose itself every single time. That's a terrifying realization if you're on the outside. And it sends a chilling message to those still inside. Stay predictable. Stay useful. Stay aligned. Or risk becoming untouchable. Here's the emotional irony. The same independence that was once celebrated now looks like isolation. The freedom that was demanded now feels like exposure. And the safety net that was rejected isn't there when it's needed most. But here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because once protection ends, something else begins. And it's not just legal or financial. It's reputational. Narrative control shifts. Sympathy erodes. And the public starts asking a different question. Not who's right, but who's responsible. And when that question takes hold, consequences accelerate fast. Because what followed next wasn't silence. It was fallout. And the fallout was far more public than anyone expected. Here's the part that lingers long after the headlines fade. Once protection ends, events don't pause. They speed up. Because without a shield, everything hits at once. Legal pressure doesn't wait. Public opinion doesn't soften. And sympathy doesn't last forever. What once felt like a private struggle suddenly becomes a very public reckoning. And that's the fallout few people were prepared for. Notice how the tone changed. The questions shifted. It stopped being about family drama and started becoming about responsibility, about accountability, about consequences. When silence holds, people fill it with assumptions. And those assumptions harden fast. This is where the story circles back to the beginning. A prince asked for help. A king refused. And the world watched what happened when the crown looked away. Ask yourself this. If the most powerful safety net in the world won't catch you, what does that say about your position? About your leverage? About how much protection you actually had left? There's an uncomfortable truth here. Power doesn't announce when it withdraws. It just stops showing up. And by the time you realize it's gone, the damage is already underway. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about drawing a line that couldn't be erased later. A line that said, from this point on, your outcomes are your own. And that may be the harshest lesson of all. Because when institutions decide survival matters more than sentiment, they don't look back. They don't explain. They don't negotiate. They let reality take over. The irony is painful. Independence was once framed as strength, as liberation, as control. But independence without backing is exposure. And exposure, when pressure mounts, can feel a lot like abandonment. So where does that leave things now? It leaves a legacy altered, a relationship fundamentally changed, and a message sent far beyond one person. It tells everyone watching that proximity to power is temporary, that loyalty has limits, and that once those limits are crossed, even a prince can be left to face the storm alone. Here's the final question you should sit with. Was this cruelty or inevitability? Because if this decision was about protecting the future, then it wasn't personal at all. And somehow, that makes it even colder. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because it isn't really about royalty. It's about what happens when systems decide you're no longer worth the risk. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this justified or unforgivable? Subscribe if you want the stories that aren't explained, only erased. Because some doors don't slam. They simply never open again.